Okay, hello everyone. Today we're greatly honored to invite Dr. Grace Waba, a legendary statistician, to our seminar series. So Dr. Waba is now a retired Schaumburg Hilldale Professor of Statistics at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a pioneer in methods for smoothing noisy data and the spline methods, and she's best known for the development of generalized cross-validation and Waba's problem. And she has applied her method to demographic studies, machine learning, DNA microarrays, risk modeling, medical imaging, and climate prediction. Dr. Waba has many, many honors, and I'll just mention a few. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and she is also a member of the fellow of the AAAS, two AAS actually. And she delivered the Fisher Lectureship in 2014, but that lecture was just renamed this year. And she wrote a book called Spline Models for Observational Data. And especially, I think to me, Dr. Waba was like a role model, because I first listened to her lecture at a Women in Statistics conference back in 2014 and was so inspirational. So that's why I'm very happy and honored to invite her to speak for us. And this is so special that this is the first time that Dr. Waba will give this virtual seminar, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Waba's husband, Dave, here to help with us to achieve this. So yeah, thank you so much, and we look forward to your talk.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, I have to say something about Waba's problem. That was done when I was a graduate student at Stanford. And now there's a long story about why it's called Waba's problem, but the point I wanted to make was Steve Stigler's law of eponymity is that the person who invented something is never the one who gets their name put on it. So first of all, it turns out that somebody else had invented it earlier, but it's my name on it. And second is I've written about 150 papers and my name isn't on anything else. But that's life. I certainly got a lot of honors, as she said, and so I retire happy. All right, well, the title of this talk is How to Incorporate Personal Densities into Predictive Models. And it has three parts to do that: pairwise density distances, regularized kernel estimation, and smoothing spline ANOVA models. Let's see, let me make sure I know how to work this pre-abstract. Okay, so this isn't the usual colloquium talk where you present some new results, say some theoretical results or a new application of interest. So this talk is some combination of review and speculation. And it began as an appreciation of my thesis advisor, Manny Parson. And he was a key researcher in both density estimation and reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces, of which we will hear more. And it's an expansion of the talk that I gave at his memorial session at the 2017 JSM. So here is a picture. That's one of my favorite pictures. That was before pandemic hairdos came into vogue. And that's Nitis Mahopadhyay, Joe Newton, who is a friend of Manny's, me, and that's Manny Parson. Okay, so the real abstract, I guess, which you have seen. So we are concerned with the use of personal density functions or personal sample densities as subject attributes in prediction and classification models. So the situation is particularly interesting when it is desired to combine other attributes with the personal densities in a prediction or classification model. So I will be describing a procedure for doing this. And rather than have theoretical results or even applied results, basically, you have to think of this as a review of the three components of this procedure. So I think that the whole approach is ripe for some good applications, but not having students to do the dirty work, I'm hopeful that somebody else's students will pick up on it. So we have subjects in a study, say some kind of biomedical study, and each subject has a sample density, which has some biological reason that you're interested in it. And we embed these sample densities into a reproducing kernel Hilbert space, RKHS, which I'll tell you what it is. So it's good that there are lots of students here, because probably most faculty members know what a reproducing kernel Hilbert space is, but I will describe the kind that we're interested in great detail. And so then we use this embedding to estimate pairwise distances between densities. So we have pairwise distances between densities, but they're not actually Euclidean if we try to project them into a lower dimensional Euclidean space, because they're in an infinite dimensional space, namely the RKHS. So we use something called regularized kernel estimation with the pairwise distances to embed the subject training densities into a Euclidean space. And the RKE is, I think, a very interesting application, and it involves some very serious numerical methods, which were done by our collaborator. And that gives us an ability to embed the subjects. Let's say there's n subjects in this data, and we're hoping to use training data to either classify or regression onto some outcome of interest. So we are now embedding all the people into a low dimensional Euclidean space, and we'll call them pseudo attributes, and we'll treat them as attributes in a smoothing spline ANOVA model. And I'll tell you what those are. So a smoothing spline ANOVA model is a way of combining all kinds of different variables that also may interact with one another to model some outcome. So there'll be elementary expositions, introductions to reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces, regularized kernel estimation, and smoothing spline ANOVA. So that will occupy most of this talk. Let's see, going the wrong way. So outlined, part one is an example of a personal density in a biological setting, an introduction to reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces. And this, for those of you who know what they are, you can have a few minutes of sleeping. But for the students, I think they're a very useful object. And I'll be explaining some simple examples. So outline of part two is to look at personal densities as attributes. So we embed the densities in a reproducing kernel Hilbert space to obtain pairwise distances between densities. Step two is then we use regularized kernel estimation to map the densities into Euclidean R space, using pairwise distances to get pseudo attributes. And I'll give a very intuitive way of choosing R, but it will generally be not too large of a dimensional R will be the home of these pseudo attributes. And you'll see how to choose R. And step 3 is to use radial basis function reproducing kernels to include the pseudo attributes of densities in smoothing spline ANOVA models. So since the embedding of these densities into Euclidean space is not actually unique, but it's invariant under rotation, and but it maintains the pairwise distances. So if we're going to include them into a smoothing spline ANOVA model, which involves reproducing kernels, we have to use so-called radial basis function kernels to include the pseudo attributes, because the radial basis function kernels only involve pairwise differences in the pseudo attributes, and that's the only thing that has meaning. And then we'll end up with some comments. So this is an example in a brain research bulletin. So there are biological time series here, and these are these are 4 different time series, and they've estimated a density of the points there, and here are 4 densities. All right, so I think I went too fast. Where are we? Okay, introduction to reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces, a trivial example. Well, reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces have orthogonal projections and so forth. Reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces are unique among Hilbert spaces in that the evaluation functionals are bounded linear functionals. What this means is that the point values of the reproducing kernel of an element in a reproducing kernel space has meaning, as opposed to ordinary L2, where point-wise values of functions aren't defined. Well, I'm going to start out with a super trivial example, which is a reproducing kernel Hilbert space in D dimensions, which is totally trivial. In general, they're infinite dimensional spaces. But we'll use a simple form of ridge regression to explain this. So we're in a D-dimensional space. We let y equals y1 up to yd, and f be f1 up to fd be D-dimensional vectors, and let sigma be a D-dimensional strictly positive definite matrix. So we can define a square norm on vectors in Euclidean D space by f sigma inverse f transpose. So that's a perfectly good measure of distance. So now let the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of this matrix be phi nu and lambda nu, and we can decompose this matrix, which is involved in the inner product, or the norm between the inner product and this Euclidean space. The ijth entry, let's see, sorry about that. So the ijth entry can we expand in eigenvalues, lambda nu's, and eigenfunctions, and then the norm in that space is f nu squared is the inner product between f and the nth eigenfunction divided by lambda nu. So if we suppose that y, our noise y, is f plus e, these are D-dimensional vectors now, where e is white Gaussian noise, then the ridge regression estimate of f, the ordinary ridge regression of estimate, where sigma is involved, is to find the minimizer here of the yj's and the fj's plus lambda times the norm in this finite dimensional space with this inner product here. Still getting you. All right, so now I'm going to tell you some geometry which will generalize from matrices to kernels. So we're using this brackets inner product to define an inner product that depends on some positive definite matrix here, or it will be positive definite functions. So this is a little bit tricky, but it's actually very elementary. So we let sigma j be the jth column of sigma. That's the matrix in the preceding slide. And we'll let sigma jk be the jkth entry. So we multiply sigma inverse sigma is the identity matrix, and that implies that sigma inverse times sigma j, the jth column of sigma, will give you zeros except 1 in the jth position. And then f sigma inverse sigma j will be, in this space, will be written with these back brackets. That gives us back fj. Now, sigma j is the so-called representer of the value of the jth component of f. That's what's going to generalize to the general reproducing kernel Hilbert space. Furthermore, sigma j inner product sigma k, this is the inner product of the jth columns. It will give us the jkth entry back. And this might be called the reproducing property. And our vector space, Euclidean D space, our vector space is the span of the representers. So now we move from matrices to reproducing kernels and Hilbert spaces. All right, introduction to reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces. The thing about reproducing kernel spaces is that there's a lot of them. It's a very general concept, and they can and should be tailored to the problem at hand, which is, but there's also some special cases of reproducing kernels that are kind of useful tools for anything where you want a smooth function. All right. But now, so let tau be some domain of interest. So it could be the unit interval, it could be the d-dimensional unit cube, it could be the sphere, it could be more complicated, complex domains to be discussed. All right, k of s and t is a strictly positive definite kernel on script t. If the sum from ij from 1 to n for any n, ai, aj, k, ti, tj is greater than 0, that's the same in dimensional, in lower finite dimensional space for a positive definite matrix. So this is a positive definite kernel. And so now nothing is being assumed about the domain other than the existence of a positive definite function associated to it. Sorry about that. So Manny was likely the first statistician to seriously introduce reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces to statisticians. Parsa in 1962, A 63 in 1970. The references are in the back, and I'll put this up so you can get them. And I got my degree with Manny in 1966, and I was one of the first students to benefit from learning about reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces. And so I learned all about them, but my thesis didn't involve them. But when I got to Madison, Professor Schoenberg and a whole bunch of other famous people were very much interested in reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces, and I knew all about them. So they thought I was a big genius, but I did absorb everything that Manny said. So here's the famous Moore-Ahrenschein theorem. Let script T be a domain in which a positive definite kernel is defined. That's all we're demanding right now. Then there exists a unique reproducing kernel Hilbert space script H sub k associated with k and vice versa. For every RKHS, there exists a unique positive different k. This goes back to Ahrenstein in 1950. We just did the trivial case where tau is just the integers from 1 to d. I'm still getting this right. All right, so now we'll let k sub s of t. The subscript means that s is fixed, and we look at this as a function of t for each fixed s. Then letting this be the brackets in the inner product in hk, for f and hk, we have f inner product k sub s picks out f of s. So that's, we just did that in the finite dimensional case, where K was a finite dimensional matrix. So K sub S is the so-called representer of the value of F at S. What that means is that if you inner product F in this space with K sub S, it picks out the value of the function of F at S. And furthermore, K sub S inner product K sub T gives me K S and T back. And this is the reproducing property of K. And furthermore, if you want to an existence proof of the Moore-Ahrenstein theorem, the reproducing kernel Hilbert space is the closure of the span of all these representers in the inner product of the space. Knowing that you can prove various things about reproducing kernel spaces. All right, now the Mercer theorem gives a class of kernels which are analogs of the sigma that appeared in the finite dimensional ridge regression case. So that's a special class. Not all reproducing kernels are analogs of sigma, because not all positive definite functions have a countable sequence of eigenfunctions and eigenvalues. All right, but the Mercer theorem says that if script T is a compact domain in Euclidean D space, and K is positive definite on T, and K sub K squared of S and T, ds dt, is some constant less than infinity, then there exists an eigenvalue eigenfunction decomposition that is, and that you can recognize this as an analog of the decomposition of back in when I did the finite dimensional case. This is in Rees-Nudge, 1955. And the lambda nu's are eigenvalues and phi nu orthonormal functions in L2 with the sum of squares of the eigenvalues less than this constant. And the squared norm of this case is, here it is phi nu squared, f nu squared over lambda nu, where f nu is a Fourier coefficient. That's handy to know, but of course we're not going to use that. So other reproducing kernels can be quite different. For example, so-called radial basis functions, which depend only on the Euclidean distance between pairs of points. And the most famous one is the Gaussian radial basis function. So S and T are in some Euclidean space, and K of S and T is e to the 1 over sigma squared, some scale factor, times the Euclidean distance squared between S and T. And functions in this reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces are infinitely differentiable. And there's another very popular class of radial basis functions, which are the so-called Matern class, which are very useful in some applications where these are infinitely differentiable. The machine class of radial basis functions has a finite number of square integral derivatives. And the squared norms in the Gaussian case and in the Matern class can be expressed in terms of Fourier transforms. Now here is a very general thing which applies to all reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces in a trivial way which you can verify. So irrespective of the positive definite functions, we let K1 be a positive definite function on the domain tau1 and K2 be a positive definite function on tau2, then K is K1 tensor product K2 is a positive definite function on the domain tau equals T tau1 product tau2. So to write it out with S1, T1, and tau1, S2, T2, and tau2, K of S1, T2, S1, S2, that's in this, and T1, T2 is in this, is the product, ordinary product of S of K of S1. There's a typo. This should be K1 of S1, T1, K2 of S2, T2. I don't know how I missed that. But so you can generate tensor products of reproducing kernel spaces easily enough. Let's see. I keep hitting the wrong button here. Okay, next page. Nope. Sorry about that. All right, now let's suppose yi, we're in a domain script t. So we let yi be some function of t and I, and ei be white Gaussian noise for n observations. And the penalized likelihood estimate f lambda of f in hk is the solution to minimize f in the reproducing kernel space. This is the sum of yi, the data, minus f of ti squared. So this is the residual sum of squares, plus lambda times the norm squared of f in the reproducing kernel spaces. And there may be other parameters inside K than lambda, which is out in front here. But lambda represents the trade-off between you fit to the data by as given by this, and so as what you might call wiggliness if, for f is hk. Well, the simplest example is if K is a reproducing kernel space of functions with square integral second derivative, then this would be lambda times the square integral second derivative of f. So for classification, the sum of squares is replaced by a sum of hinge functions, sometimes called the kernel trick, or it can be replaced by a log likelihood from the exponential family. But the question is, how do you solve this? This is an element in a reproducing kernel spaces. Well, here's the one theorem that really should be called the Kimmeldorf and Wabe theorem, but I think it's just generally known as the representer theorem. If this is a norm here, then the Kimmeldorf-Wabe theorem in it's known as the representer theorem, says the minimizer will be in the span of the representers of evaluation, which is K sub Ti of T. So Ti here, this is the representer of evaluation at Ti. So this is an element of the space. And if you inner product this with F, you get F of Ti. All right. So I'll just go back and make a remark here. This is, I've written this as a norm. It could be a so-called semi-norm, like that there may be a polynomial, for example, that's in the null space of this. Then you get a similar theorem. The notation is a little messier though. All right, so now we move into our proposal for using personal densities as attributes. So step one is to embed the densities, each density per. So now we're back to having n people, and each person has a density attached to them, and lots of other attributes attached to them, and some outcome in the training set. And we want to build a model that predicts the outcome for new customers. So we are going to embed densities in a reproducing kernel Hilbert space. So the population case says let P of T be a density on some domain script T, and let HK be a reproducing kernel Hilbert space with kernel K. Then the embedding of P onto HK is given by F. This is an element in the space, and we get it by integrating over script T, K dot T, P of T dt. So F will be an HK, and the sample version of F is given by, let's call it Fx, where the sample density is x1 up to xk, is the sum of k of xj dot. So, so this is a map from a sample density with k elements in it to an element of a reproducing kernel density. I'm doing a bad job with this. Sorry about that. All right. So where x1 to xk are IID samples from P. All right. So each person now has a sample density, and the sample density is mapped into an element of reproducing kernels, of the reproducing kernel space. So if we were treating P as an image of, say, an X-ray density, then the XJ would be some regular or other, would be on some regular or otherwise designed grid. So we can imagine that there are lots of things that can be like certain gridded images that could be treated as densities. All right, so now if we're given a sample from a possibly different distribution Q, say the training set, then here's a different sample density of the Y's, and let's call that GY. So this is an element of the space. Now, here's a theorem that under appropriate conditions on K in here, two distributions will be mapped into two different elements of HK. And the pairwise distances between these two samples is taken as the norm of the distance in HK. The subscript says that it's the norm, the reproducing kernel norm. And if we multiply this out, we get, this is the pairwise distance between the sample densities denoted by X and the sample density, the samples from the density denoted by X and the samples of the density denoted by Y. Now here's just a remark, is that if K is a non-negative bounded radial basis function, then up to scaling, we have actually mapped F, X, and GY into pars and density type estimates. All right, so now we have pairwise distances in a reproducing kernel space, and we want to map them into a R-dimensional Euclidean space, which is not, R is not too big. And the points in this R-dimensional space, we'll call them, they will be the pseudo attributes. So each person is going to have a pseudo attribute. but the map is going to preserve pairwise distances between the people. So given the pairwise distances from step 1, we embed the densities in a low dimensional Euclidean space by using something we call regularized kernel estimation, which is by Fan Liu et al. With Steve Wright as a very famous numerical analyst. And it turns out that there's an optimization problem to solve here. So what we do, we're given an n-dimensional positive definite matrix sigma, the pairwise distances that it induces, let's call it dij hat, is the ith entry plus the jjth entry minus 2 times the ijth entry. And the RKE problem is given observed data dij, we find this sigma here to minimize the Euclidean difference between the pairwise distances plus lambda times the trace of sigma. So if we solve this problem, we will have we'll find a matrix that has this problem, the pairwise distances, and then I'll tell you what we do with it. All right, now the fun thing about this was that I had looked at this problem for maybe a year until I was blue in the face and trying to get some kind of analytic solution, of which I don't think you'll find. But Steve had, there were some very new numerical algorithms. This is something called a convex cone optimization problem. And some software for solving this problem had just come out. And so we figured, well, we must have something new, because without this software, you'd never have any practical use for this problem. So the data may be noisy or not Euclidean, but the regularized kernel estimate provides a non-unique embedding of the n objects, these n patients, into an r-dimensional Euclidean space. And the dimension of the space is governed by lambda as follows. So we let the spectral decomposition of this matrix we're looking for, here it is, and the largest R eigenvalues and eigenvectors are retained to give the n by r matrix Z times gamma r, lambda r to the 1/2. So these are the r-dimensional versions of the eigenvalues and eigenfunction. And we let the ith row of Z, which is an element of Euclidean R space, be the pseudo attribute of the ith subject. So thus each subject may be identified with an r-dimensional pseudo attribute where the pairwise distances between the pseudo attributes respect approximately, depending on R, the original pairwise distances. Even if the original pairwise distances may be Euclidean, the RKE may be used as a dimension reduction procedure when the original pairwise distances have been obtained in a much larger space, namely an infinite dimensional reproducing kernel Hilbert space. So we note that if it's used in a predictive model, it's necessary, oh God, Dave, something is interrupting this, a software update. Can you skip this version or remind me update or otherwise? That's dreadful. Okay. Sorry about that. So even where were we? So the RKE may be used as a dimension reduction procedure where the original pairwise distances have been attained in a much larger space, like an infinite dimensional reproducing kernel space. And you have to, in order for you're going to build a model with this, then if you're going to use it in a predictive model, it's necessary to know how a newbie fits in. Now, a test of this RKE method turned out to be very interesting. It's in this paper with Van Loo and colleagues. This is a 3D representation of pairwise dissimilarity scores between 280 protein sequences obtained from pairwise alignment scores. So alignment scores are some way known to biologists for looking at deciding what the distance is, how much dissimilarity there is between protein sequences, but they're definitely not Euclidean. So RKE was used to get the Euclidean embedding, and lambda was chosen to capture 95% of the trace of the fitted matrix. The end result was 3 eigenvalues. The top 3 eigenvalues were retained. And here are 4 different clusters of types of protein sequences. And it looks like it did a good job of classifying them. So here's how we looked at the eigenvalues. So the effect of varying lambda on eigenvalues of the regularized kernel estimate of sigma on a log scale. So lambda's very big here. And here we choose this one. The oh, your internet connection is unstable. All I need. Sorry about that. It turned out that the top 3 eigenvalues got about 75% of the trace of 90. They got about 95% of the trace of the matrix. That got us lambda is 1, and that's what got us the picture, the impressive picture that I had just showed you. All right, so now smoothing spline. Now the step 3 is how do we combine this these pseudo attributes with other attributes using radial basis function kernels. So what the restriction of using radial basis function kernels is due to the fact that the pseudo attributes themselves are not uniquely determined. They are only up to rotation. They preserve the pairwise distances. So the radial basis function kernels use only pairwise distances. So briefly, now I'll explain smoothing spline ANOVA models. And well, if this was a bunch of people in a room, and I ask how many people have ever seen them, but I see 8 people here. Can't tell how many people have ever seen them. All right, so these models are functions of D variables, which allow for interactions between the variables. So we're now back in Euclid, function of T1 up to TD. And the TIs are in the ith domain. So let's see here. All right, so this decomposes in a function, so-called main effect functions of 1 variable plus functions of 2 variables and so forth. And they terms satisfy ANOVA-like side conditions for ordinary analysis of variance. So F is assumed to be in a tensor product space with of D reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces, which we'll call H alpha. Alpha is 1 to D. And H alpha is a reproducing kernel Hilbert space of functions T alpha that admits a decomposition of a form that it has constant functions on the domain plus an infinite dimensional subspace. of all the functions in the domain, all the functions in the reproducing kernel space that integrate to integrate to zero according to some averaging operator. So what we have now is a tensor product of reproducing kernel spaces, each of which can be decomposed into a constant function on its domain, plus everything else in H alpha. And we have an averaging operator such that the average of one of alpha is 1, and the average of everything else is 0 for F alpha and H alpha. So this is just like ordinary analysis of variance. This is a reproducing kernel space generalization of ordinary analysis of variance. All right, so what happens? So this is a geometrical version in reproducing kernel spaces of what happens in ordinary analysis of variance. We expand H, and our space is the constant functions plus H alpha, and these are perpendicular spaces with the averaging operator that goes with the space, and we have 1. And we expand this out, and this is a constant function over a tensor product space. These are a reproducing kernel space involving main effects, only one run kernel involving tensor products of 2 kernels and so forth. So F alpha is an H alpha, F alpha beta is an H alpha, H beta, and so forth. Well, I'll probably finish by the next few minutes. So extensive literature and software exists for fitting these models. There are 2 books by my former students, Chang-Gu and Yudong Wang, and there's a whole bunch of papers starting around 1995 with Chang-Gu and Yudong Wang as collaborators and so forth. So to use the pseudo attributes in ER found by regularized kernel estimates in a reproducing kernel Hilbert space, we must confine ourselves to, for these pseudo attributes, to use radial basis functions, which depend only on pairwise distances between the arguments. So let H alpha be the RKHS associated with K, and let K be, for example, the multivariate Gaussian with argument S minus T, Euclidean norm. So the constant function over ER is not in this space with the Gaussian radial basis function kernel, but we adjoin 1 of alpha to this space, and we define the averaging operator needed for the ANOVA decomposition as the limit as we average over the domain. So we see that E alpha of 1, the constant function is 1, and E alpha of F alpha is 0 for F alphas and H alpha. And so we have our decomposition, and this term then can be combined into the SS ANOVA model. So thus training sets with observed or coded pairwise distances as pseudo attributes may be treated like other direct observations in soothing spline ANOVA models. And we note that the R variant Gaussian can be used as a density or as a positive definite function, and any other multivariate density, which is a radial basis function, when considered as a function of 2 arguments, would work. So, summary and comments. So we've given an elementary introduction to reproducing kernel spaces and showed how it can be used to estimate pairwise distances between densities. We didn't discuss how to choose kernels or how to choose the tuning parameters and other parameters inside K, except for the tuning parameter in the regularized kernel estimate. And we didn't discuss semi-norms, that is where the most popular one is functions with square and integral second derivative. That's a semi-norm in that it doesn't penalize a constant function or the first derivative, or the constant or the linear function. So we demonstrated how a large set of the pairwise distances can be mapped into Euclidean space by using regularized kernel estimation to get pseudo attributes, and how the pseudo attributes can be used in a smoothing spline ANOVA model to incorporate them along with other attributes in a penalized likelihood estimate for prediction, or a support vector machine for classification. So the the distance between observations and data, we have the log likelihood for Gaussian noise, but other distributions, they're likely can be used. And a support vector machine, you can use the support vector machine penalty fit. It remains to apply this way of looking at densities as an attribute in analysis of observational data, where personal densities can interact with other variables. And there are all the references, and I'll put them up at my homepage, and that's the end of it.
Thank you very much for the talk, Dr. Waba. So yeah, so now it's about the time for us to ask questions. Especially, I would like to welcome questions from our graduate students, because I agree with Grace that maybe the reproducing kernel Hilbert space is not known to every student, since many of them are new and they're first year, some of them are master students. So yeah, there might be many questions the students have. So please go ahead. Yeah, be brave enough and unmute yourself and ask questions. So maybe I can go ahead and ask one question first. So Grace, is a very, very illuminating talk. And my first question is that in the second and the third steps regarding the regularized kernel embedding, and you have to choose a number of dimensions in the Euclidean space. And in the last step for the prediction or classification, you also need to have some regularization over there. So my question is, how would we balance the two? Do we want to like keep a large dimension in the second step, or do we prefer to find a balance in some way?
Hey, that's a great question. As you know, we didn't tell you anything about how to balance things. And in the regularized kernel estimation, we made an arbitrary decision to use 95% of the trace as the criteria. So that's, can't prove anything about that. I mean, that was a choice. And but once we've done that, when we go to the spline ANOVA case, there can be a smoothing parameter for every term in there. There can be a whole bunch of them. And if you have a complicated model with main effects and two-factor interactions, we've done a lot of examples, but we've never gone past two-factor interactions. But still, you can have a lot of tuning parameters. Well, if you're going to fit a lot of tuning parameters, you need pretty large sample sizes too. But that brings me to the so-called generalized cross-validation, of which, what can I say? There was a period in statistical life where there were lots of people trying to decide how to choose tuning parameters. And whenever you have a trade-off between signal and noise, which is what it amounts to, I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. Um, if you know the strength of either, well, usually the noise, if you have say a Gaussian model with white noise, if you know what the variance is of that noise, then there's something called an unbiased risk estimate. But you need to know the variance of the noise. You generally don't know that really. But then there's AIC's information criteria, and there's a lot of other methods floating around, but the one that I'm peddling, and I've been peddling, is a so-called generalized cross-validation. And I can tell you briefly where it came from. Well, back about 40 years ago when Svante Wold was visiting, we were trying to figure out this ordinary cubic smoothing spline. We just have noisy data on 0, 1, and you want to put a nice smooth curve through it, which draftsmen used to use a mechanical French curve to do that. You wanted the computer to do it. How should we do that? And we suddenly sat in a meeting together and said, aha, cross-validation. So you have n points, you leave out 1, and you fit the n-1 points, and you predict the missing point, and that gives you one number, and then you go through all the data one at a time, and you can accumulate how we do, and you minimize that. Well, under certain conditions, that's fine. But when you try to prove something about it, you run into, you get stuck somewhere, because that if you have white noise, that problem should be invariant. The problem of choosing the smoothing parameter should be invariant under rotation. Because Gaussian noise white Gaussian noise is invariant under rotation, and it isn't, or it may not be. So what do? So the end result was something called generalized cross-validation, which is invariant under rotations, and which in my book and elsewhere, there's various theorems that show that it's good for predictive mean square error. So if you're dealing with Gaussian data and the spline ANOVA model, and it has several lambdas out there in front of the different terms, then you can use the generalized cross-validation. If you have big enough data sets, then you can estimate more tuning parameters with it.
I see. Okay, yeah. So basically, I think my message, the summary I get was that, so for the second step, we try to retain a large dimension to keep as much information as possible from the embedding. And then for the third step, for the smoothing spline, we use generalized cross-validation to choose the tuning parameters.
You've gone through this? Yeah. You have an example? Or, I mean, I would certainly love to see the paper if you're writing this up.
Yeah, I think it's very, very interesting, especially I think for our students, we are so familiar with having our variables or covariates as Euclidean vectors, right? Or each variable is a scalar value. But here we can have our covariates as functions. We just need to find embeddings for our functions. And that's very cool. I think that will be the very important take-home message for our students. So that will make the data, you are now be able to analyze a much richer set of data. So for example, every individual may be represented by some density, not just a vector.
Oh, well, yeah. We'll have to hear more about it. That's very exciting. But
yeah, so yeah, I think it's very, very interesting. And also I think for our students, they can also see, okay, you can regard the reproducing kernel Hilbert space as a generalization of the Euclidean space you are very familiar with.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of good software. There's Spline and Nova software. And well, the link, I guess you found, there's a link on my homepage to the software for the RKE. I guess you have that.
Yeah, I want to make a note that so Dr. Wawa has this set of slides on her webpage. So if you're interested in studying it further, you can go to her webpage and download it. Okay, I can also share it. So Grace, can I share it with them? So if I can download it.
Right.
Yeah, I'll do that.
It'll probably be a day or two before I get it up. So you can certainly pass the slides out to the students.
Yeah, that would be so helpful.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, it's been fun talking to you. I wonder, David, maybe we'll try to run through some of the other people there. I see Honig, Shanky, Suda, Bog, Hancock, Zoo, Annie, Fudan, Stella, Queen. Oh, big audience.
Yeah, we have a big audience here today. And if you can show up your face in the image, that would be great. I see several faces
there's
here.
Andrew. Oh, no, I have to say something about Andrew, who is a brilliant colleague of mine. And I've been, before I retired, I had this a small research group. Once I discovered that I had 5 students and I didn't have enough time to spend too much time individually with them, we started meeting as a group every week. And that went on for about 40 years, actually. And, but when I retired, I didn't have any of my own students, but Andrew picked it up and he's been running the Thursday group. And well, it's a lot of fun. I sit there and the students and Andrew pick out the speakers on Thursday, and the upcoming schedule is already set, and some of Andrew's students and other students at Madison will be talking. And if anybody wants to see what's going on in Andrew's group, he'll probably be willing to let people listen in. So you can write to him.
So Andrew, can you actually show up? Yeah, I see you are here.
Yes. Yeah, hello, Jessica.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, Andrew. Nice to see you. Yeah, we met before at the conference, I think.
Yes, we met before.
Yeah. So Andrew is a faculty member in the stats department in Wisconsin-Madison, and he's Grace's colleague.
I think, you couldn't do this before the pandemic.
Right.
I think it must be fun for the students to connect with students in other departments.
Yeah,
there are other universities that are interested in the same thing. And,
yeah.
The more brains.
They're no longer restricted by our physical locations.
Yeah. Right.
Great.
Yeah. Well, I have to publicly thank my husband for preventing worse things that I could have done with the overheads.
Thank you so much, Dave. So yeah, before we finish, are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, please don't waste this opportunity to ask your questions.
Hi, Grace, may I ask one question?
If it's not too hard.
You talked about the, after we obtain the pairwise distance between densities or any, in general, and objects, followed up by embedding into a Euclidean space. I wonder what's the significance of embedding them into a Euclidean space? Besides, obviously, we can visualize this. For example, look at the alignment problem, right? You can visualize these different proteins in a nice way. But in terms of modeling or understanding these data, what's the Do we need to embed them at all? Or we just need the pairwise distance to do clustering
Oh,
and
yeah,
so on and so forth?
you need to get a pairwise distance somewhere.
Yeah,
from
let's say I'm
somebody.
thinking after we have the pairwise distance, what scenario I should consider embedding? Or what scenario I could just be happy with doing a clustering algorithm? In general, what's the guideline for that?
Let's see, I'm not sure how to, well, there are a lot of different ways you can compare densities.
Mhm.
And of course, there's a lot of different ways to choose the reproducing kernel Hilbert space. So, but in a way, depending on the reproducing kernel you use, it's sort of like smoothing things out and then looking at the differences. But it depends really on the kernel that you choose. So and it seems to work in some, makes sense in some situations, but this 3-step procedure starts with a pairwise density somehow. And so you could substitute if you have a favorite method for comparing 2 sample densities, now the sample densities don't have to be at the same point. I mean, they can be different sizes. There's a particular approach. The densities can have different sample sizes and be sampled at different points too. So there's a lot of flexibility. But if you have a particular way of comparing sample densities that makes sense in the context of your problem, I mean, the end result would be that if you want to land up with a smoothing spline ANOVA model, you have to start with some pairwise densities, and the proof of the pudding would be a working model.
So Ching, I think your question is regarding after we use the first step to obtain the pairwise distances between individuals based on the sample densities, why would we need a second step for the Euclidean embedding, right?
Right. I mean, in what scenario we need to do embedding?
The embedding takes,
would that already good enough in some applications?
As what?
When you have the pairwise distance, right, between these densities.
Yeah.
If you do clustering, right, or group them into different groups, it seems that's already solved the problem, right?
I'm not sure.
Maybe I think maybe I didn't follow. I didn't understand.
Well, the idea was to get the pairwise distances, to get a pairwise distances that make sense for your problem, and then embed them in a Euclidean space, which would be a convenient, and use the pseudo attributes in the Euclidean space, which can then go right into your smoothing spline ANOVA model.
Oh, so the distance is obtained after you embed them to Euclidean space? Is that
first embed in the reproducing kernel space? So that provides you a flexible way of getting a distance between sample densities of different sizes and different sampling schemes and so forth.
I see. I was thinking about like multi-dimensional scaling. You have the distance and then you embed it, but that's not the way.
Let's see.
Is that related?
I used to know what that was, but I can't answer that.
I think I'm on the same understanding as you do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but I think, so Grace, I think for the last step, definitely, right? So once we have the Euclidean embeddings, we have a lot of flexibility to do. Like you said, we can do SVM for classification.
Yeah, the classification. I'm very proud of some work that Hao Helen Zhang and Yu Hyun Lee did on classification. So you're replacing some squares with a so-called hinge function for classifiers. And the end result of a collaboration with those two former students of mine and Yi Lin were to demonstrate that the support vector machine was estimating the sign of the log odds ratio. So why it worked.
I see. Well, that's very great to know.
Yeah, and you could put in, instead of sum of squares, the log likelihood of any member of an exponential family. You have a convex optimization there. So.
Yeah. So it's a regularized optimization, and you can have the flexibility in defining the loss.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to see your results. And
yeah, I think it's very, very interesting, and we're very interested in applying this in our research. So hopefully we can reconnect and show you what we find. Okay, so any more questions from the audience before we conclude?
Professor, I have a question regarding the pseudo attributes. Is there a way to interpret them?
A way to what?
To interpret the pseudo attributes.
No, because they're not uniquely determined. They're only determined up to a rotation. They preserve all the pairwise distances, but any how do I say this? Any rotation, they're all equivalent. The only information that's taking them is from the pairwise distances. So any one point has no meaning. I mean, it has no interpretation.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
You just look at
it's
the
like
distance.
Yeah.
It's just preserving an approximation to the pairwise distances. And that's why you have to use radial basis functions when you go into the spline ANOVA, because the radial basis function only uses pairwise distances. There's some other stuff that we use pairwise distances, not in this context, but in a Beaver Dam eye, it was a big eye study, Beaver Dam eye study. There were about a third of the people had relatives in the study, and we had a pairwise genetic distances for a third of the patients. And so we built pairwise distances into a reproducing kernel space.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. If we don't have any more questions from the audience, I think we will stop here. And let's thank Grace again for her wonderful talk and for making this efforts to really give this remote talk to us despite this pandemic. We are really grateful.
Thank you, everyone. My pleasure.
Yeah. Okay, so Grace, I think I will send the recording to you for your approval later, but we will have this link available on YouTube for sure. It's just that we will decide whether we will make the video searchable or not, depending on Grace suggests the decision later. We'll see. But the link will definitely be sent to the students for your review.
Unfortunately, it's going to capture all my, every time I went backwards when I meant to go forward, but we'll see.
That's no problem. There's no problem for that. I think all people understand. Yeah, I think the slides are very, very concise. And so that's why I think the students will definitely want to study it further. Okay, so that's all for today. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you next week. Bye. Bye, Grace, and bye, Dave.
Bye-bye.
Bye.